I'm Tage Rai. For several years, I've been concerned with this question: what motivates someone to hurt or kill another person? And if we think about the leading theories in moral psychology and aggression, they tend to focus on these sorts of explanations. So lack of self-control, psychopathic tendencies, lack of empathy, not perceiving our victims in human terms or our actions in moral terms, pursuing self-interest. And what I would argue is that built into all of these sorts of theories is a kind of core implicit assumption, which is that violence happens when something has gone wrong in the mind of a perpetrator. They failed to feel the right emotions. They failed to control their emotions. They couldn't resist selfish temptations. And as somebody who was studying moral practices across cultures, I found these sorts of explanations somewhat dissatisfying. And the reason was I couldn't use them to explain a case like this. So this is taken from a court case in Saudi Arabia. Two men have gotten into a fight. One of them was paralyzed, and the paralyzed victim has asked the judge if his attacker can be paralyzed in turn. And when he asked the judge this question, the judge doesn't say, absolutely not. Instead, he says, I'll look into it. And he writes letters to all of the hospitals asking them, well, can we actually do this? And when the doctors get the letters from the judge, they don't say, are you insane? We're not going to intentionally sever a man's spine. They say, maybe, maybe even at the exact same vertebrae, so that it's really equal. Now, unless we're willing to assume some kind of collective psychosis among the plaintiff, the judges, and the doctors, those sorts of mental disorder explanations for violence aren't really, they're not going to really make sense of cases like this. I also couldn't understand a situation like this one from those perspectives. So this is taken from ethnography of bar fighters in Louisiana. And when they ask the bar fighter, hey, why do you keep getting into bar fights? He doesn't say, oh, I know, I'm so stupid. I just can't control myself and I lash out when I'm angry. What he says is, I'd feel guilty if I didn't fight. I'd feel like I let everybody else down if I didn't fight. This does not strike me as someone whose primary problem is a lack of self-control. I could go on, but just reframing my earlier question, what I would argue is that we have a number of theories that focus on how moral inhibitions against engaging in violence break down, but we have much less work on trying to understand why people are impelled toward violence in the first place. Most of the sort of, I would group the sort of meta-theoretical approaches to this under sort of two broad umbrellas that subsume many other theories. One is kind of instrumental gain, so the idea that, well, violence is just the most efficient means to get what we want. The other are these sort of reactive theories that argue that violence is just kind of a biologically based response to provocation or threat. Both of these theoretical approaches tend to be pretty underspecified, so we never learn much about the utilities or about the nature of the provocations. And so I became interested in, well, is there another way of thinking about violent desire to help us make sense of the violence we see in the world? And so together with the anthropologist Alan Fisk, we started looking at perpetrator accounts, secondary analyses, ethnographies, historical documents of violence across cultures and throughout history on as many violent practices as we could, ranging the full spectrum from things like dueling and self-harm to war and ethnic violence, to sexual assault, to terrorism. And what we found was that across all these sorts of cases, the primary motivation for most perpetrators when they hurt someone else, that those motivations are moralistic. They hurt other people because they believe they should. They believe that those people deserve to be harmed. They believe that not harming them would be morally wrong. And in most of those cases, they're supported by their local peer groups who actually see their actions as worthy of moral praise. And so the big claim here is that when we're thinking about the relationship between morality and aggression, it's not caused by the absence of morality, it's caused by the activation of our sense of morality. Now, at this point in the talk, on this day, I do not need you to agree with me that most violence is motivated by moral sentiments. Like I said, 60 and 30. So I'm giving you an overview of the kind of work we do. So I'm skipping over some of the evidence. All I need you to believe, all I need you to do is to be open to the possibility that there may be some large chunk of the variance in violence that's motivated by moral sentiments, and that we need to do a better job of explaining it. Because what I'm going to suggest is that once we shift our perspective towards seeing violence as being driven by the presence of morality rather than its absence, then the relationships between violence and social psychological processes like dehumanization, like self-interest, like self-control are all going to shift as well. Let me show you what I mean. I'll start with our work on dehumanization. So the philosopher David Livingstone Smith, he argues that it's very difficult psychologically to kill another human being. What dehumanization does is it liberates aggression by excluding a target from the moral community. Just breaking that logic down a little further, the idea here is that we have a kind of moral inhibition against harming fellow human beings. What dehumanization does is it causes perpetrators to no longer see those victims in human terms. Once you no longer see them in human terms, that moral inhibition turns off, and you're now indifferent to their welfare and you're fine with harming. This kind of causal chain in which we don't want to harm people, but we will if we no longer see them as people, would make a lot of sense if all we ever did was kill other people. But as we all know, we do so much more than that. So as Adam Gottman points out, we humiliate our victims. We put them through show trials. We make them watch their fellow victims die first. These are not things that you would do if you were really thinking of your victims in non-human terms. Or as the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah puts it, this sort of treatment is the kind of treatment we reserve for creatures we recognize to have intentions and desires and projects. In other words, it's the kind of harm we reserve for our fellow human beings. And so my collaborators, Pier Carlo Valdesolo and Jesse Graham and I, we started to wonder, well, is there a different route to violence that you can get through moral motivation? And we can start with the same kind of premise that, well, yeah, there's this inhibition against harming other people. We find it very aversive. But what we would argue is that for moralistic aggression, you actually have to perceive your victims in human terms in order for them to deserve what's happening to them, in order for them to really feel what's happening to them fully, in order for them to understand why they're being harmed in the first place. And when those components are in place, then you can have your moral motives overcome your moral inhibitions against harming other people, creating a kind of active desire to harm. Now, if this is right, then this suggests that there are kind of two very different kinds of harm motivated by two very different kinds of psychological processes. In one case, you have dehumanization, which is going to enable instrumental violence. So these are cases in which you don't have anything in particular against the victims, but you need them to suffer in order to get what you want. To the extent that you dehumanize them, you're going to be more okay with that. You're going to be more okay with harming them without a sense of guilt or remorse. In contrast, what we would argue is that dehumanization cannot cause moral violence because dehumanization actually strips away the very human qualities that make moral violence meaningful in the first place. To get at this, we're going to do a series of studies. We're going to start with these attitude studies. We're going to look at violent practices that differ on instrumentality and moralistic motives. So for example, an instrumentally violent practice might be something like support for sweatshop labor. You don't have anything against sweatshop laborers, but you benefit from their suffering. And so the question is, to what extent does that relate to your human perceptions of them? In contrast, you might, for a morally violent practice, we might think of something like executing murderers for their misdeeds. These are people who you think of as bad and want them to be harmed because you think they deserve it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to ask people about their views toward these violent practices. We're also going to ask them to assess the humanity of these targets. We do that by drawing on work by Kurt Gray, so some of his mind perception measures. And here's what we find. So first I'm going to show you the instrumentally violent practices. What you get is this nice negative correlation. So to the extent that you no longer see these targets in human terms, you're more supportive of violence toward them. This is exactly what you would predict from a dehumanization perspective. But our question is, what's going to happen in those moralistic cases? And in the moralistic cases, that effect goes away. There simply doesn't matter whether you see a victim in human terms or not when you're thinking about your support for moralistic violence. Now, of course, these kinds of practices differ on many different attributes besides morality and instrumentality. So in the next study, we wanted to find a single practice that kind of has elements of both. And we decided to look at drone strikes. Because in the case of drone strikes, there are the terrorists who you want to kill because they deserve it. But then there are also the civilians who get killed as collateral damage as a means toward achieving your goal. And what we're going to predict is that it's actually going to be dehumanization of those civilians that is predicting support for drone strikes, not dehumanization of the terrorists who you actually want to die. And so again, humanity is on the y-axis, approval is on the x-axis, and what we get is this nice negative correlation again for the civilians, that to the extent that you no longer see civilians in human terms, you're more supportive of violence, of drone strikes. But when we look at terrorists, we get no such effect. It simply doesn't matter whether you see terrorists in human terms, as far as whether you're going to support drone strikes that result in their deaths. Now I'm going to lose some of the ecological validity of those attitude surveys in order to isolate causal mechanisms. And here, what you can see, what I've done is I'm going to ask our participants to imagine that they have the opportunity to harm someone. And what I'm going to vary is whether their motivation for harming them is instrumental. So are they harming them in this case for money, or would they be harming someone for moralistic reasons? So in this case, punishment for a moral transgression. And then the other thing that we're going to manipulate is how we describe the target. So in some cases, we're going to describe the target using very humanizing language. So describing their kind of mental and emotional states in more depth. This is taken from previous work by Nick Haslam. In other cases, we're going to describe them using much less humanizing language. So those sort of in-depth descriptions aren't going to be there. And the question is, how are those humanistic or dehumanizing descriptions going to affect willingness to harm? And is this going to be different depending on the motivation of the perpetrator? And so what you can see in the instrumental cases is that if you're thinking about harming someone for money, then when that person is described in dehumanizing language, you're more willing to harm them, exactly what you would predict from a dehumanization perspective. But when you're thinking about harming someone as punishment for a moral transgression, that effect goes away. There's no more relationship anymore. Now, in the next study, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this question around. So instead of thinking about how dehumanizing a target might influence your willingness to harm them, I'm going to ask my participants to imagine that they either did harm someone or that they did not harm that person. And then I'm going to see whether imagining harming someone actually changes your perceptions of their humanity, and whether that depends on the kind of motivation you had to harm them in the first place. So now on the y-axis, we have perceptions of humanity. On the left, we're going to look at the instrumental cases. On the right, we're going to look at the moral cases, in which you imagine that you did not harm the person. Gray bars are going to be cases in which you imagine that, yeah, after thinking about it, you did decide to go through with the harm. Again, based on the kind of vignettes I was describing earlier. And so here in the instrumental cases, what you can see is that when you imagine that you had the opportunity to harm someone for money, and that after thinking about it, you did decide to go through with it and harm them, you perceive that person as less human than if you imagine that after thinking about it, you did not harm them. Exactly what we would want from a dehumanization perspective. The question is, what happens if you're imagining a moralistic case? And when you're thinking about harming someone for moral reasons, it doesn't matter whether you imagine harming them or not. That doesn't affect your perceptions of the person's humanity. Now, at this point, you may be wondering, well, hey, the theory seems to suggest that actually, if I have moral motivation, I should be increasing my perceptions of someone's humanity. One possibility is that there are kind of threshold effects. So in this final study, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the same study design I had in study 4, only now I'm just going to describe those victims as being unconscious. Prior work from Kurt Gray has shown that that artificially suppresses those humanity ratings. So that's going to give us more room to see if there is this kind of humanizing effect. So same study design as before. I'm just changing whether the victims are described, now they're being described as unconscious. And when you do that and look at the instrumental, now there's no effect. So it seems like if if the targets are already being dehumanized, or if they're already being seen as low and humane, there's no reason to perceive them as less human than before in order to justify the harm that you did against them. Question is, what's going to happen in those moralistic cases? And here now we finally see that elevation effect, that when you imagine harming someone for moralistic reasons, then you actually perceive them as more human than when you imagine not going through with harm against them. Taken together, I think these studies suggest that dehumanization can predict, it can cause, and it can be caused by instrumental violence, but not moral violence, and that at least under some conditions, moral violence may actually be linked to more humanization, not less. Before moving on to the next project, I just want to be clear, I am not making the claim that dehumanization doesn't matter. Dehumanization absolutely matters. I just want to argue that dehumanization might matter in a different way than we previously thought. So I would argue that anytime we have kind of third-party structural violence cases where we are standing by while other people are suffering because we simply don't care about them, that's dehumanization at work. But that is very different from the kind of harm we pursue against enemies who we think deserve it. Under those conditions, we may perceive those targets in very human terms. And I think it's important that we distinguish these two different kinds of violence. All right, I'm going to move to some in-press work looking at material incentives. This is a picture of former ISIS leader Baghdadi, and he's giving this speech about a kind of return to traditional values and the ascent of ISIS. But honestly, a lot of people were really distracted by that fat Rolex he was sporting. And people criticize him as being a hypocrite after the speech. And for me, it raises this interesting question about, well, how do moral and material motives intersect with each other? And what I'm going to argue in this talk is that in the same way that we can crowd out the willingness to read or the willingness to donate blood, we can crowd out moralistic punishment by paying punishers to do it. And the reason for that is that when you punish someone, when you hurt someone for moralistic reasons, part of the reason you're doing that is to signal to other people that you are a good person. And when I pay you to do it, then it's going to interfere with that signal. No one knows now what's the real reason why you're doing it. And so to get at this, I'm going to use an economic games design. So these are real games with real stakes. The way this works, this is a third-party punishment game. We're going to allocate $20 to player one. They can allocate any portion of that money to player two. I'm really interested in player three. Player three has the option to take away money from player one if they don't like the allocation to player two. In my design, I'm going to just present them with a very simple binding dichotomous choice. If player one offers $0 to player two, are you willing to punish player one by removing money from them? And what I'm going to vary is whether my player threes receive a bonus payment for doing that. So in some cases, the player threes are told, if you punish player one, we will pay you extra money. What you can see is in the no payment condition, about 70% of our participants say, yes, I will punish player one if they offer $0 to player two. And the question is, what's going to happen if they are paid an extra bonus payment on top of what they're already getting in order to as compensation for punishing? And what we see is that punishment is actually cut in half. So standard economic model would have assumed that punishment could only have gone up if we're paying our participants. In fact, we get the opposite effect. And the reason is because the reason I think is going on is because payment is corrupting that moral signal that you send through punishment. In order to isolate that causal mechanism, I'm going to go back to the judgment designs. Here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially ask fourth party observers to look at punishers and evaluate their actions. And in some cases, they're going to be evaluating punishers who punish for no payment, and others they'll be evaluating punishers who punish for either a small payment or a large payment. And what you find is that it is the case that when you accept payment for punishment, your actions are viewed as less morally acceptable. The punishers are also viewed as having worse moral character. So this is evidence that receiving payment does in fact corrupt the moral signal of punishment. And so the question is, for me then is, well, clearly in the real world, people do have to mix material and moral motives. So how is this overcome? And so in this third study, I'm going to show you, again, a judgment study. What we're going to look at is, how do our punishers restore their willingness to punish if we can repair that moral signal? So these first two conditions are just going to basically conceptually replicate what we found in the economic games design. So when we ask people to imagine that they would be paid for punishment, they're less willing to punish. But in a third condition, what we tell them is, hey, we've asked people about this, and what they say is, even if you receive payment, everybody understands that that's not the reason that you're punishing. And the question is, when we tell people that, when we give them that kind of reassurance that they won't be judged for receiving payment, then what happens to punishment? And what you see is punishment is restored under these conditions. And so taken together, what I think these sorts of studies are telling us is that when people are motivated by moralistic sentiments in order to harm others, they may not respond rationally to material incentives. And I think this is really important to think about in a world where a lot of aggression faces material consequences, even if it's actually motivated by moralistic concerns. Okay, before I go on, just be clear, I'm not suggesting as a policy mechanism that we should pay people to be violent as a way to end violence. Like I said, in the real world, people are mixing material and moral motives all the time. Instead, for me, the kind of take home from these studies is to think about more carefully, well, how do perpetrators resolve the tension between their moral motives and their material motives? And then in terms of policy, how can we interfere with the kind of moral narratives they're telling in ways that might disincentivize them? Okay, I'm going to briefly talk about our work on self-control. This is taken from a memoir by Daniel Jennis. He served 10 years in prison. And what he's talking about is that whenever he got into a fight, he had to count backwards and do other sorts of relaxing breathing exercises and stuff like that. And what he said is that, it didn't really make much sense because most of the violence he saw in prison wasn't really kind of explosions of temper where people lashed out. Instead, it was very deliberate and planned. So there'd be some sort of beef in the morning, and then everybody would recruit their buddies and they'd go back to their cells and they'd armor up and fashion weapons and they'd all meet up in the yard. And his point is that there's a lot of violence that nobody actually wants to do, but you have to do it. And for me, the question is, what happens in those cases when violence is undesirable, but is morally required? And so the way I'm going to get at this is I'm going to ask people to recall incidents in their own lives in which they could have engaged in violence or not, or in which they did engage in violence or they did not. And I also want them to think about times when they should have done it, but also times when they should not have done it. And I'm going to cross these kinds of scenarios, these kind of recollections against each other. And at the same time, I'm going to administer this kind of retrospective self-control measure. This is taken from work by Nathan DeWall many years ago. And we're going to see, is self-control predicting violence or not? And so these first two conditions are cases in which you yourself believe that violence was wrong and you should have avoided it. And under those conditions, when you believe that violence is wrong, when you recall those incidents in your life, the incident in which you restrained yourself and did not engage in violence is tied to greater self-control. This is replicating that earlier DeWall work. But what I'm really interested in are the cases in which you think violence was morally right. And when you think violence is morally right, you reverse that effect. That actually people recall having greater self-control in the conditions in which they, under circumstances in which they engaged in violence where they thought it was the right thing to do. Now, of course, these sort of self-report studies have lots of demand characteristics. So in the next study, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the recollections that people provided me, their memories, to build hypothetical vignettes that I'm going to present to a new set of participants. And I'm going to look at whether those participants trait levels of self-control. So this is this is a measure that should be more robust against those demand characteristics, whether that's going to be predictive of their support for violence or not. In cases where you really wanted to be violent but knew you shouldn't, or in cases where you really did not want to be violent but knew that you should. And so here's what we find. The self-control ratings are on the y-axis, willingness to aggress in these hypothetical situations on the x-axis. First, what you see is that for violence that is desirable, but you perceive it as morally wrong, we get this small negative effect where, as self-control is going up, support is going down. Really what we're interested in, though, is the other kind, violence that is undesirable, but you think is morally required. In those conditions, you get this significant increase where more self-control is predicting more willingness to aggress. The difference between these slopes is also significant. Now, this data is really preliminary, but it's actually some of the first data linking higher self-control to more aggression. In these and where it's happening is in these moralistic cases. I'm just going to close by talking about some conclusions, future directions. So I think most of the people in this pre-conference think of issues of morality and justice as a kind of through line that touches and deals with all of the sort of major issues in social psychology. And so what I want to leave you with is the idea that if that's true, and if we've been wrong about the way that we think about morality and aggression, then what that means is that we might be wrong about the relationships between aggression and all sorts of social psychological processes. I've shown you a few. I've shown you dehumanization and material incentives and self-control. But in the work that's ongoing in our lab, we're starting to think more about the relationships between moralistic aggression and cooperation. We're trying to think about how victims construe the harm that's been done toward them in moral terms and how that construal is really affecting their experience of violence. We're starting to think about building on others' work, the sort of social bonds that perpetrators build through collective violence. And I think these are questions that you really only get at when you start to think of violence as being driven by the presence of morality rather than its absence. With that, I'm going to just close. Thanks to all my collaborators over the years. One note, I'm actively recruiting grad students. So, if you have people who are excited by this kind of work, put me on their radar. I'd love to work with them.